Voter fraud is a buzzword in the political climate. It is for the last 3 years, but it's not a recent problem. It's not a new thing people like to talk about. People have been talking about voter fraud in this country for decades. In fact, I'm going to make a few references to the 2000 election. I realize statistically most of the people in this class probably weren't even alive when that election happened, but if you were and you remember it, great. You're going to know what a hanging chad is and you won't have to Google it when I bring it up. But let's go to basics here. What is voter fraud? Justin Levitt, who's a law professor at the Law School of Los Angeles, said voter fraud occurs when individuals cast ballots despite knowing that they are ineligible to vote in an attempt to defraud the election system. Lawrence C. Minette, PhD, who's an assistant professor of political science at Barnard College at Columbia University, said this covers knowingly and willingly giving false information to establish voter eligibility and knowingly and willingly voting illegally or participating in a conspiracy to encourage illegal voting by others. In the 2020 case, a lot of people said illegitimate votes happened. There was a lot of fake ballots, there was a lot of unnecessary ballots, all this other stuff. And you are kind of left wondering, where are these people? Who are these people? Are you just making people up? Who are you saying are the illegitimate voters? Where did they come from? There's not a lot of details given for the 2020 election, nor has there ever really been a demographic nailed down as to blame for those extra votes or redacted votes. And here's why. Because it's hard to make up a demographic that's accounted for. So, let's go back in time, 20 years prior to it, to the 2000 election. Bush, Gore, great time. If you weren't alive, it was kind of a hellscape. So, here's what happened. Besides the hanging chad thing, which I'm not going to get into, if you don't know what a hanging chad is, you can Google that in your own time. There were two demographics that were involved in voter fraud. This was the argument being made, at least. Fraudulent votes were coming from illegal aliens and convicted felons. So, two obvious things in the US system, at least they should be to everybody. If you commit a felony, you're found guilty of that felony in the court of law in the United States, you lose your right to vote. If you're a convicted felon, you lose your right to vote in all elections. Period. That's been in place for a long, long time. So, if you have a big group of votes coming in from specifically felons, okay, well, those are fraudulent votes. You can't count those votes. They shouldn't be allowed to cast those votes because they don't have the right to vote. Now, I'm not here to discuss if that's fair or whatever. There's a whole moralistic argument going on as should felons be able to vote. We're not here for that. The other side of it that should be much more cut and dry is this right here, illegal aliens. If you are not a citizen of the country, you shouldn't be able to vote in the elections. Why? Well, because you're not a citizen. So, in 2000, there was a lot of arguments that happened, especially around the state of Florida, which is where, if you research it more, there's a lot of problems that happen in Florida. It's kind of the Georgia of the 2020 election, where a lot of illegal aliens, supposedly, were casting votes. That's a problem. That's voter fraud. An example. You don't have as many specific details in more recent elections because there's less substantiation to the claims. So, what causes voter fraud? People, that's voting fraudulently. That's what causes voter fraud. Now, the Journal of Experimental Political Science at Cambridge University brings up the fact that political elites sometimes seek to delegitimize election results using unsubstantiated claims of fraud. Who would have guessed? And the Berkman Center research publication says, despite the consensus among independent academic and journalistic investigations that voter fraud is rare and extremely unlikely to determine a national election, tens of millions of Americans believe the opposite. Surprise, surprise. Now, why is that? Because misinformation is a powerful thing, and in a polarized two-party political system, it's hard to seek any kind of fairness. Yet here we are, trying. What causes voter fraud is just people trying to break the law. What causes the real problem behind the concept of voter fraud is people taking something that is a legitimate issue, though not a major one, and attempting to turn it into a major issue for political stake, political argument. Let's blame it on something. You got to have the scapegoat, you know. And also voter frauds, it hits the tongue good. It's a good buzzword. Throw it on the headlines of the talking heads at nighttime on any news station, and it's going to be good. Put it in big bold letters on a social media post, people will read it. The problem with voter fraud right now really isn't so much voter fraud as the political movements that you can get to surround voter fraud, which is kind of what also is the solution to voter fraud, is when you fix voter fraud and how you want to fix voter fraud, that will usually align with some political beliefs that may or may not polarize you one way or the other. So we've got kind of two corners on this one, on the boxing match of the bipartisan political stage. Michael T. Gilbert wrote a book called The Problem of Voter Fraud, in which he says voter identification laws have provoked a fierce controversy in politics and public law. Supporters claim that such laws, voter ID laws, deter fraudulent voters and protect the integrity of the American election. Opponents, on the other hand, argue such laws like poll taxes and literacy tests before them intentionally depress turnout by lawful voters. John H. Fund, in the other corner, wrote a book called Stealing Elections: How Voter Fraud Threatens Our Democracy. As you might assume by the title, he thinks that voter fraud is stealing our democracy. He's very for things like voter ID laws. However, the Stealing Elections book by Fund was actually written following the Obama-McCain election, which in 2008 was also rife with people saying that there was voter fraud, because of course it was. Here's the thing. Using the political sphere, using the legal system, and the way the Constitution is set up that we can change laws to amend them so that it makes it harder for people to vote can be done in a way that can protect the integrity of the American system without keeping people away from their right to vote. A mixture of both is necessary. In areas where you need more stringent voting laws, they should exist. In areas where they are unnecessary, they should not exist. The most key point to make here is this. Is it a problem? Yes. Is it as big of a problem as people say it is? No. And to tack on one last thing, personal pet peeve here, poll taxes and literacy tests, things of that nature, were disgusting displays of Jim Crow law that were used to oppress an entire ethnicity and their descendants of people that were already oppressed in terrible areas to keep them down. That is systemic racism and is a black spot in the history of this country. Do not say that needing to show your birth certificate to vote for the president is the same thing, because it delegitimizes and undercuts the strife that was gone through by millions of people for decades and the fight that was done to rectify those laws to get us to the place where we can have equality in the voting system today. Thank you.